So I know that Psychonauts is a relatively new game, so if you aren't prepared for a more in-depth discussion about it, that's fine. There will be spoilers for the whole game throughout the course of this. I will be mostly talking about pretty early game spoilers. I will warn you again towards the middle of this when we get to some actual, real boy spoilers, so just keep that in mind, and I hope you enjoy. Also, I'm going to be making frequent references to the original Psychonauts throughout this, so if you want to know what happened in that game, check out my video on Psychonauts 1. So yeah, let's get into it. Cargo cults were an odd, if distinctly human, phenomenon. When pre-industrial island peoples came into contact with soldiers during World War II who seemed to produce infinite, valuable, manufactured good from the heavens, they slowly began to venerate those people they interpreted as emissaries of mystic entities from beyond the veil. They even went as far as imitating the marches and behaviors of the soldiers after they left, hoping to bring back the planes that granted them those unlimited goods. I say this not to mock the people for their misunderstanding, but to point to an excellent example of how we rarely internalize the external world in ways that are logical or even accurate. Our internal worlds are wild, complicated, and deeply abstract, and far more often we ourselves see the cargo planes of our lives as distant gods just as well. We take our experiences and craft narratives of them, seeing ourselves and the people around us as heroes and villains, gods and demons, milkmen and mad scientists. If all you want to know about Psychonauts 2 is if its mechanics function and its story is competent, the answer is yes. But if you want to know if it actually measures up to its legacy, the answer is more complicated. I've seen nearly unfettered praise heaped from both critics and players towards Psychonauts 2, which I just cannot find myself sharing in. But describing the whys is difficult, likely because Psychonauts 2 does not have many obvious failings. Where it does fail is understanding the abstract ways we have of telling ourselves the story of our own lives. And just kind of being bad sometimes, admittedly. The first level in Psychonauts 2 is full of a lot of the kinds of inconsistent and underwhelming writing I found endemic of the game, while also having extremely impressive visuals. So let's talk about the odd cocktail of dreams that is Psychonauts 2. The mind of Lobato answers an interesting question that had been batting around in my brain since the Milkman conspiracy in Psychonauts 1. What would it look like if the actual Psychonauts needed to extract information from someone's mind? The unfortunate part of all this is that Psychonauts 2 has to do a lot of explaining as to why we are here, since this does not follow the events of Psychonauts, but the events of the Rhombus of Ruin, and by extension I have to do that explaining as well. I will try to limit talking about the Rhombus as much as possible because it is bad and hurts to play, literally. Rhombus of Ruin is a VR-exclusive game originally made for the PSVR. I don't get motion sickness, but the sheer amount you have to move your head in the Rhombus of Ruin at awkward angles and quick jerks gave me a massive headache and I gave up my attempt to play it. It is full of plot holes and logical inconsistency, perfectly exemplified by the aftermath of a plane crash where Mia ends up in a bus underwater. Even putting aside that a watertight bus makes little sense even in the comic universe of Psychonauts, how she would get or even be put there without filling the inside of the bus with water, I have no idea. This scenario and many others make no sense and only serve to weaken an already weak and confusing game. Rhombus has also done no favors by being an early generation VR game, making its controls not just awkward but painful, especially when you have to move items with your head. While a cool idea as it can feel neat moving things with seemingly only the power of your own mind, it quickly starts to be wildly uncomfortable when you need to jerk items around and move them long distances by whipping your head about in fast motions repeatedly. The important things you need to know are that Lobato abducted Truman at the end of Psychonauts, that Lobato has a tragic history where he was lobotomized to remove his psychic powers, that Lobato is pretty much a good guy now, and Truman Zanotto, Lily's father, was rescued but is in a coma. The fact that the entire opening of Psychonauts 2 is predicated upon a bad VR game that very few people played is an excellent reason of why these kinds of side stories are usually exiled to the non-canonical zone. However, not only the intro, but many of the opening hours of Psychonauts make frequent references to the rhombus that I found both confusing and alienating.
At least we made it out of the rhombus of ruin.
Why did you deny us intel when we hailed the Motherlode?
I think his Silurium poisoning must be worse than we thought.
All that being said, Labata's mind is very fun to look at, and his personality breaking more and more through the Psychonauts facade does make for some fun, almost Cronenberg-esque set pieces. This does all lose a few points in many respects for being a rehash of Psychonauts' Meat Circus, but for a tutorial level it works much better than Oleander's Battlefield. The entire introduction does address one of my main concerns from Psychonauts. Where that game's setting didn't fit its target audience, Psychonauts 2 is much more aware that it is primarily made for late 20s and early 30-somethings that were originally fascinated with Psychonauts in their teens and young adulthood. The fact that the first scene of the game is Raz having had his dreams of Psychonauts' glory seemingly dashed by mundane office work is a wonderful nod to that. However, just like almost everything in this game, this comes with a downside. This time, my frustration comes from the end of the original Psychonauts being entirely retconned out of existence, at least when it comes to Raz's appointment as a Psychonaut. The second Raz and the crew arrive at Psychonauts HQ, the acting head just laughs off Raz's appointment and sends him all the way back to the bottom, forcing him to start on his goal of becoming a Psychonaut all over again. I really dislike this kind of writing, as it always makes the previous installments feel weaker in retrospect, and provides all too similar arcs for the character to go on in the present one as well. Going back to the end of Psychonauts, its ending is pretty deflated when you think of Raz's triumphant appointment as a sham with no real meaning. And on top of that, it means that the new installment will inevitably feel like it's treading water, unerringly hitting many of the similar beats already hit so well, this time with less feeling. This brings me to one of the things I liked least about Psychonauts 1 and 2. I didn't get around to talking about the other kids at the camp in my review of Psychonauts, but they are pretty shallow and mostly act as an odd joke here or there, or as simple set dressing to make the Whispering Rock Psychic Summer Camp feel less barren. I'm not terribly opposed to this. I think the game is better for their inclusion, even if I would have liked to have seen just a dimension or two added to each of them, as they're all essentially a one-note joke with legs. But that being said, they aren't shoved so far into the front that those weaknesses drag the game down. Psychonauts 2 teases pretty early on that Dogen Bull, one of the original game's most memorable summer camp kids, has a family member who is one of the most prominent members of the founding Psychonauts. I was at least a little interested to see if they were going to try and do exactly what I might have hoped, and add a dash of character to the tropey preteens. What actually happened, however, made me sigh heavily in discontent. Instead of trying to salvage some of the pre-existing ensemble, they thought adding 5 more characters they don't intend to flesh out to the cast would be a great idea. Honestly, looking back, I had to go look for footage to see how many of them there were, because I forgot most of these kids. And the skateboard one I just didn't remember at all. So you have Pirate Radio Kid, Emo Girl, Skateboard Girl, this guy who has a yo-yo and a hat, and the Whale Girl, who's the only one that actually gets a smidge of personality, seeing as she serves as the game's resident Bull. I still couldn't be bothered to remember her first name, however, so that's what she is. So really amusingly, while I was editing this video together, I went back and realized there are actually 6 kids. I feel it really appropriate that I forgot about that until I was looking back over footage, because that's how forgettable they are. I forgot that there was a 6th one who is another girl who is vaguely suspicious of things, and I think that's her only real character trait that she gets. These kids were a mistake, and they just... I don't know why they're here. I really wish they had learned that having such a large side cast would almost inevitably lead to them being barely developed, especially in Psychonauts 2, which already feels like it struggles to run long enough to get its main plot in. Not only do these characters get little development, but they are pushed more to the forefront with the game's first real-level finale. And even worse, they are featured very prominently in the game's climax, which feels especially hollow when the game spent so little time on these kids that I don't know a single one of their names. But it wants me to believe that they're helping Raz in his moment of most dire need is some real moment of emotional significance. Every attempt to make these kids feel worthwhile is entirely unearned, and what little time is spent on them is wasted. And I want to emphasize this is a very similar mistake as the one made in Psychonauts 1, with the original ensemble, but they really doubled down on that misstep. Speaking of missteps, one of the main reasons I think I found Psychonauts 2 so underwhelming was the significant changes it made to the Psychonauts mechanic set. Psychonauts is a genre orphan, a singular title with no equals or competitors. It merged the complicated problem-solving mechanics of traditional adventure games with 3D platformers. While the adventure game mechanics were significantly simplified, they gave a tremendous number of ways to explore environmental interactions. A quick few examples were using paintings to create portals or ladders, or bribing a peasant with $1 you found in a fireplace. These mechanics were important to the feeling of Psychonauts, as these interactions contextualized your actions as solving problems in the minds of others, rather than just reaching an arbitrary point on the map as you might in traditional platformers. Psychonauts 2 strips all of those old adventure mechanics out in favor of being a pure platformer, and this is a key reason to me it seems much weaker than its predecessor. To see an example of this, we need to jump ahead to one of the game's later levels, where you are in the mind of Psychonauts founder Cassiopeia, who has broken her psyche into numerous personas. One of which was a factory worker, trapped in servitude to a vile mobster and needed to steal evidence to turn into the police and escape. You must relive this memory on her behalf to reincorporate this persona back into the whole. It is very difficult to feel as though there is anything you could do to solve this, with your only tools being punching things and jumping on platforms. And indeed, when you have jumped your way to solving your problems, I cannot help but feel a certain sense of hollow achievement I did not feel when I wormed my way through the labyrinthine mental pathways of Boyd the Milkman. Despite the strong point of Psychonauts not being its platforming and combat, it is a much more central focus here, and the mechanics, while less glitchy, are nominally improved, if at all. Double jumping is snappier, with the second jump coming more immediately, and a cute little flourish on the thought bubble that represents it, but the levitation floating power is now severely limited in how long you can use it. Frustrating this more, I never really found this severely actually limiting, so I wonder why this decision was even made, as it mostly just makes the jumping and floating feel bad, as opposed to actually limiting you in any significant way. I initially thought this was even worse, as the ability to transition between levitation and rolling on the levitation bubble isn't initially available and has to be enabled in the controls? Why this is the case and is never tutorialized to the player or even presented as an option baffles me, since it's so key to movement feeling good. Invisibility, confusion, and shield are removed for mental connection, time bubble, and projection. As power is introduced later in the game, the three aforementioned abilities from the original Psychonauts game never saw much use, confusion most of all, as it's set in a series of 3 levels accomplishable in any order right before the finale. Rather unfortunately, projection fills the same role and has the same issues as confusion. It's set in a series of 2 levels, accomplishable in any order right before the finale, and has very little use outside of the incredibly specific puzzles that require projection. I will note it's really cute that they had the voice actor who played Gur in Invader Zim play the projection though, especially since Raz is of course voiced by the same actor who voiced Zim. It's very cute.
Hey,
Not now. I'm working.
how's it going?
Feeling a bit flat.
Mental connection works as a grappling hook and is a tremendous missed opportunity in my mind. This is true in 2 ways. First, the mechanical. Mental connection has very little opportunity for skill expression, as it does just amount to looking in the vague direction of a stray thought, which serves as the anchor point for the grapple, and then clicking the next in the sequence until you reach the end. The second is somewhat mechanical and somewhat narrative. In the level where it is introduced, it's used as a puzzle-solving tool, allowing you to link thoughts to change the internal worlds and beliefs of the mind you're in. Even in this level, it can often come across as frustrating, with Raz just telling you the solution to all of these puzzles if you get it wrong even once or twice, despite how fun it is to make the wrong links to see what happens, and how obvious the solutions often are.
If Hollis wants to solve her money problems, she's gonna need to accept some risk. That's not going to help us go to the casino.
He sucks.
I think the only way to get Hollis to take us on a mission to a casino is to get her to associate risk with money.
That's hardly the worst of it, however, since after this level, the aspect of thought linking is dropped entirely and never used again. There is so much potential for use of this as a novel puzzle-solving tool to add depth with the removal of the wider adventure game archetypes. But no, it's just tossed out the window after being used once. Time Bubble is the only new power I think is used pretty effectively throughout the game. I love the way it's introduced.
I don't know how to beat it. It's just too fast.
Dear universe, please shut up! There we are. This is good. Let's stay here.
I love the idea of externalizing that pure desire to just make everything stop. And the fact that this power is used heavily both in combat and outside of it, providing opportunities to make any section with moving platforms easier. The implementation of this power was very well thought out and utilized in diverse and interesting ways. It's a shame the rest of the new powers didn't get this level of attention. Speaking of combat, I don't like it. Referring back to Psychonauts 1 again, its combat was also pretty weak, but pushed enough to the side of most levels to be largely inconsequential as an issue. Psychonauts 2 was very aware of that frequent criticism of the first game and aimed to fix it by putting a lot more in while resolving very few of the key issues with Psychonauts combat. Combat in Psychonauts 2 is arguably worse, despite the clear attempts at improving it. Enemies are tankier, taking numerous hits and power usages to take down, and there are many, many new enemies, and that part sounds good, right? Well, when you consider one of the biggest problems of both Psychonauts 1 and 2 is that keeping all the powers you need to exploit enemy weaknesses on your 4 available buttons for them is a tremendous issue, and you now regularly need at least 6 powers by the end of the game to exploit each of these weaknesses. You'll constantly be pausing combat to bring up your radial menu and pick up the right power to use on the next enemy, killing the pace of combat. As an example of this, in the same combat you might run into judges, which need pyromancy and telekinesis to be fought effectively, but aren't weak to time stop, alongside enablers, which require time stop or mental connection to be hit. You never want to be without levitation, most enemies need to be hit with Psyblast, and bad moods cannot be defeated without the use of clairvoyance. That's 7 powers you need to swap between with your 4 slots. It just really doesn't work well. The other main complaint I have about Psychonauts 2 is its badges. Many of the abilities and passive powers granted to Raz throughout Psychonauts have been stripped away and added back piecemeal in the badge system. You can have up to 3 small side passives active at any time that range all the way from petting animals with levitation to key aspects of movement and combat like being able to ground slam while using the levitation ball. I really dislike these kinds of systems in modern games and vastly prefer those when powers were just handed out as permanent passives in Psychonauts 1, as they destroy the ability to balance the game around specific powers. For example, in Psychonauts, the game could specifically be balanced around the player having or not having a very specific set of powerful passive abilities, but in Psychonauts 2, that's basically impossible with a tremendous array of mostly useless badges that you can't have any guarantee the player thought to get. This only contributes to the combat being a boring slog, as nothing you unlock really feels all that strong, where in Psychonauts 2, when you could finally ignite a huge group of enemies or bounce your Psyblast between foes, you felt like a god amongst censors. The mechanics of Psychonauts 2, then, may not be particularly on point, but one could argue that neither were the original Psychonauts. The real thing that I came to Psychonauts 2 for was more of the wild and imaginative worlds that managed to be humorously yet truly expressive of complex individuals. Psychonauts 2 is much more self-serious, both in its choice of subjects and the way their minds are expressed. I don't think this serves the game particularly well, as the levels on offer this time have much weaker themes and concepts. Tim Schafer is quoted as saying in the development of Psychonauts 1 that he wanted to make each level a power fantasy of some kind, and even the levels that might put the player in a seemingly weaker position, it's always you that uncovers the conspiracy, unmasks the villain, or wins the game. Psychonauts 2 lacks this clarity of purpose, and each level serves as an exploration of the minds and the history of the Psychonauts more broadly than any particular focus outside of that. Let's look at a few of those minds in closer focus to point out exactly what I mean. Each level outside the first two and the last one is dedicated to exploring the minds of the Psychic Six, the original founders of the Psychonauts. While once the strongest psychics in the world, their conflict with a powerful psychic with unparalleled ability to manipulate water named Maligula ended with one of their number dead and the rest broken and isolated from each other. As time passed, each of them grew either less in control of their faculties or simply apart in the wake of their loss. It is revealed that Ford in particular suffered from this, as Maligula is the reason his mind was shattered, since he was personally responsible for killing her. Fixing Ford's shattered mind is the objective given to the player when they can finally explore the overworld of the map of Psychonauts freely, and may accomplish putting the parts of him back together in any order. This time, he has splintered off into a bowling ball attendant, mailroom clerk, and hairdresser. It's actually an unknown brain that Raz stumbles upon that I wish to talk about first. Forced to find a replacement brain for the mailroom clerk Nick to gain access to the room of Postmaster Ford, Raz does what he has to and puts the mysterious brain to work that he might gain Nick's aid. I love the idea behind the unknown brain's levels. It revolves around a brain that's been sitting inside of a jar devoid of sensory input for so long that even the simple act of existing inside a body again drive it mad with sensation. And so Rasputin must dive into the mysterious gray matter to help them make sense of existing all over again. All of this is framed as a Woodstock-esque music festival where the avatar of this mind, voiced by Jack Black, needs to get his senses back together, visualized as members of a band preparing for their big moment. Again, Psychonauts 2 provides excellent visuals and a fun concept with inferior mechanical implementation of the ideas presented to its predecessor. Psychonauts 2 suffers from this lack of mechanical diversity. The concept of the level just has no unique mechanics or framing that really separate it from any other level. Just as described before, the big complicated problem of putting this mind back together is solved with platforming and punching bad guys. Nothing here works to tie you to the problems the mind is suffering mechanically or deepen your connection to the world in any way besides the visual. It's just the vague mix of the mechanics that every other level shares. The closest this level comes to introducing unique ways of experiencing the game is allowing you to briefly drive around the small overworld to select which part of the stage you wish to go to next. All of this might be fine, but Psychonauts already showed us that Double Fine can do better. That we can have impressive and creative visuals along with equally impressive and creative mechanics to stage each mind. I don't want to be null negative on this level, however, as in terms of laying the groundwork for the rest of the story, this level is incredibly efficient. It slowly becomes clear that we are in the mind of one of the missing members of the Psychic Six, the one presumed dead, Helmut Fullbear. The setting guises the other members of the Psychic Six as the senses and carefully sets up their character and relationship in ways that make much more sense as the game goes on. I also love how the level starts, where you climb out of some of the deepest repressed memories of Helmut's mind by climbing out of a memory vault. It's kind of a twist on the existing aspects of the setting and mechanics I would really have liked to have seen more of throughout this game. The return to that vault at the end, when Helmut has regained his senses, does feel pretty powerful, and advances the plot nicely, showing how, despite the best efforts of the Psychic Six, the team were unable to defeat Maligula without significant cost, but also hinting at how she was once a friend to them who they thought could still be reasoned with. It is this main conflict that the game revolves around, and I think this is yet another reason that I found Psychonauts 2 so... While an interesting story, it's not much concerned with the now, and there are not many tangible stakes to the world Raz is actually inhabiting until the game's final hours. Another reason for this is that much of the game's opening concerns the Psychonauts chasing down a group they believe is trying to use necromancy to resurrect Maligula. Yes, that's right. Necromancy is a plot point in Psychonauts 2 for some reason. 9 repeatedly insists that this is impossible even in the cartoon world of Psychonauts, and that necromancy isn't real. Go figure. I don't think this ever even feels like a real threat to the player in the moment, as it's at best confusing, especially since after the game's opening this is never really brought up again, and the necromancy plotline makes no sense and has no conclusion. Compared to that beautiful little trail of breadcrumbs that Psychonauts lays down, that actually materialize into Oleander betraying the camp and becoming the big bad, Psychonauts 2 just doesn't manage to foreshadow its future threats as well. It does make some efforts, I'll concede those, and we'll get to that eventually, but it just isn't on the same level in my book. The other plot line set up in these early bits of the game is the implication is that there must be a mole in the Psychonauts. Keep this in mind, as it does have a payoff, but while the game brings it up repeatedly, there aren't that many clues on it until the later reveal. I actually do like one of the levels, however, and that is the Line of Compton Boole. Not every level is devoid of strong concept mechanics, and that mind shows that quite nicely. Compton is highly sensitive to the thoughts of others, and especially seems susceptible to the inner voice of animals. Raz needs to enter his mind to get to the ford with the bowling alley attendant persona, as he locked the alley to anyone without a senior membership card. Boole's level is Psychonauts at its strongest. Boole, who constantly feels overwhelmed by the many eyes cast upon him and judged by his friends for his failures, sees his internal world as a game show, with Ford, Otto, and his second head of the Psychonauts as judges. Raz has to aid Boole in preparing various dishes for the main three judges to consume, throwing sapient ingredients into various cooking apparatuses, each taking their own time or interactions to resolve. This is by and far the most creative use of the powers available to you. It still manages to underutilize most of the player's power set, only really taking telekinesis when pyrokinesis seems like a natural fit for a cooking show, but whatever. Aside from that, my only real complaint is that it is by and far too easy. But the change of pace, reframing the mechanics, and the lighter tone are all quite welcome. It's hard to have a bad time playing out the wild shenanigans provided by this wildly entertaining chopped knockoff. While I don't really enjoy the combat of Psychonauts 2, I love that the thing that breaks up the pace with some of the combat segments is odd and awkward TV commercials, where Raz just kind of wanders onto set. Even the boss fight after the cooking is one of the game's only real memorable bosses, requiring you to search out the correct ingredients from the vomitous expulsions of the judges, while simultaneously dodging said expulsions. Psychonauts 2 doesn't generally do memory vaults well, and I'll get to that later, but it's also not true in the case of Compton. His memories are very effective at fleshing him out as someone who loves animals, but in his first attempt to help them, he accidentally just scanners all of the animals in an entire animal shelter. It's horrific and tragic and beautiful at fleshing out who he is all the same. Not only is everything on display incredibly creative, but it also very well incorporates Compton's trauma and failures without completely giving away many of the details of the history of Grulovia, showcasing the powerful capability of the premise of Psychonauts to fully show us the inner world of their subjects and tell a wildly powerful narrative. This is just the perfect level of abstraction to simulate exactly how I imagine someone might internalize the outside world. It's perfect. The fragments of Ford's shattered mind, though, provide the perfect counterpoint to this almost immediately. It's slowly revealed that the three different levels are moments from Ford's life pertaining to the lost seventh member of the Psychonauts, Lucretia Mux. And it is at this point that we're going to get into real boy spoilers for anyone who hasn't played this game yet, so one final warning. You have it right here, it's this. It turns out that Ford developed a budding relationship with Lucretia when they and the other future Psychonauts were first experimenting with their psychic powers. A formative moment of said relationship was when they snuck out together for a bowling alley date. After this, however, Lucretia ended up leaving the Psychonauts to defend her home country of Grulovia. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's the home country of both Maligula and the Rasputin family. Ford tried to contact her with a letter when he began to believe she was losing herself, but that letter never arrived. So Lucretia lost more and more of herself without her friends, eventually succumbing to her dark alter ego, Maligula. And after her defeat and supposed death, Ford cut out the parts of her that led Maligula to rise. These 3 moments are the basis of the 3 personalities Ford displays in the Mother Lobe. A bowling alley attendant for his prized memory of their first date, a postmaster who will ensure all the mail goes where it is destined, lest a tragedy such as he experienced before should happen again, and the barber who cut out of Lucretia's mind the parts that made Maligula. It is the directness of especially the bowling alley and postmaster that rob Ford's mind of that abstract believability. Not only does the lack of abstraction rob the player of the joy of putting together the puzzle pieces and solving for themselves how the minds they jumped through ended up the way they did, but it rings as hollow. As I stated in the introduction of this video, rarely do we internally interpret the outside world exactly as it is. But that is very much what we see in the 2 more direct minds of Ford, with very little exception playing out his memory exactly as they occurred, only the faintest veneer of abstraction painted on. The barber persona is the only one that really escapes this, capturing the humanity as Ford, as he would not want to admit to himself the truth of his vile act, when he essentially lobotomized Lucretia, hiding it even in his own mind as a metaphor. While it might hurt to see someone like Ford villainized in this way, it provides a nuance to his character most games are afraid to portray, revealing that even though he always did what he thought was necessary, that was sometimes not so much the right decision. The mind of Hollis Forsythe, the current leader of the Psychonauts, also demonstrates Psychonauts' 2 propensity to focus on spectacle over making the game actually entertaining to play. She was originally a medical student, and the intro to her mind sees Raz walking through an X-ray film viewer. While very visually impressive, actually moving through the segment involves some of the simplest possible jumping puzzles and makes no real use of the space to do anything more interesting than affording an occasional moving platform while people talk about the plot in the background. It just shows one more time people making the game had neat ideas for levels, but didn't take that to the next step and really consider how to implement those ideas into the mechanics, making the actual experience of playing the game just more of the same, ultimately. To discuss the game's climax, it's important to take a short break to briefly describe Raz's family. For as much as I complain about how Raz being demoted from Psychonaut to intern deflates the ending of Psychonauts, getting to see the entirety of Raz's family works to strengthen the original title. There were a lot of lingering questions about why Raz believed his family hated psychics, especially with his father being a psychic, and the answers all tie nicely into Maligula, the water-wielding psychic. On top of that, the Aquatos convincingly work as a family, each member managing to almost immediately display some strong character traits, cementing them in my mind, and maybe most of all, Raz's grandmother Nona, who is just absolutely adorable. One of the many main reasons that they seem so believable is the set of immediately apparent conflicts, disagreements, and compromises that emulate family environments. An easy example of this is how Raz's father's recent more accepting attitude towards psychics and enthusiasm for all the psychic arts is still some matter of conflict between Raz's mother and him, leading to them falling in their first attempt to practice their new acrobatic formation when an argument about implementing psychic flourishes erupts. Meanwhile, Raz's older brother still despises psychics, and his older sister is secretly a psychic who isn't prepared to make that known to the rest of her family. I think it's too easily and often that stories are afraid of introducing these small character flaws and intolerances, but fail to realize both the narrative potential for growth this gives and how many people are messy, difficult, and complicated, leading to such conflicts, especially within families where people of dissimilar ideas and philosophies are drawn together, like it or not. The only real shame is that the only member of the Aquato family who gets more attention as the game goes on is Nona. I mentioned earlier that I would have liked to have seen the new kids drop for the original Whispering Rock kids, but cutting them so that more time could have been spent on the Aquatos would have also been very worthwhile, as the Aquatos are far more interesting and well realized. Regardless, we yet again see a strength and a failure packed into one. The Aquatos are fun and well written, but the rest of the cast of Psychonauts 2 was too large for them to get the narrative payoff they deserve. It's also worth noting that spending time with the Aquatos is entirely optional, and there is a fair chance some people played the game never knowing there were any scenes of them outside of their introduction, further making me believe the writers really were unsure of where to focus Psychonauts 2, and tried to stuff in about 2 games worth of story and characters into one to somewhat mixed effect. There is one small issue with Psychonauts 2 that the Aquato family emphasized quite nicely, especially with Rasputin and his father compared to the rest of the family. Raz and Augustus, along with the rest of the original Psychonauts crew, just don't look quite like they are from the same world or aesthetic as the rest of the Psychonauts 2 cast. While the character designs in Psychonauts all kind of look like the developers pulled a bunch of polygons out of a box and made those into characters, Psychonauts 2 has essentially the aesthetic left over from Broken Age. While the characters still have odd and inhuman shapes, they have a more expressionism meets Adventure Time art style that clashes pretty strongly with the original Psychonauts style, which I always felt kind of like a 3D Ed, Edd n Eddy. I think the second head Hollis demonstrates this extremely well. Placed against the original cast, she clashes immensely, feeling like she was just picked out of an entirely different game and dropped into this one, that game, of course, being Broken Age. The many background members of the Psychonauts also stick out, looking and moving not entirely unlike Muppets, which isn't a problem in and of itself, but they just don't jive with much of the rest of the game's style. It might be a small complaint, but these odd choices in art style did consistently stick out to me. That brings us to talking about the events after Ford's brain has been reassembled. Putting everything back together, he fully remembers that after Lucretia gave into her dark impulses, becoming Maligula and killing so many of our fellow Grulovians, he used a device capable of directly editing someone's psyche to lock Maligula away deep, deep in the mind of Lucretia. In the deluge of Grulovia, where Maligula killed so many, she also killed Raz's grandmother and grandfather. Seeing Augustus without any parents, Ford manipulated the mind of both him and Lucretia, convincing them they were mother and son, while simultaneously instilling their inherent phobia of water that would be passed down throughout the generations. I mostly dislike this payoff to the plot threads that have been laid down up till now about the connections between Augustus and Maligula, as it just strains credulity that all of this has happened because it just so happened that Raz ended up at a summer camp where Ford was headmaster. These kind of difficult, strained, retroactive connections are not only incredibly contrived, but again weaken the plot of Psychonauts by insisting an insane amount of coincidence into that plot as well. These kinds of small worlds where somehow everyone ends up being connected in the end by nothing more than chance are a personal bad writing pet peeve of mine. With this revelation, the player is tasked with getting the mind rewriting machine to work again as Maligula is waking up, and the only option Ford insists is to again shove her deeper down into the mind of Lucretia. There are 2 major obstacles to this machine's operation: bees and tremendous vines. The bees are solved by the mind of Cassiopeia, which I mentioned earlier, and the vines are removed by curing the mind of Lily's great-uncle Bob Zanotto. Bob is insinuated to be an irascible drunk who has pushed away all the friends he once had, and when Raz tries to help him, he also grows infuriated at his good intentions. Bob's brain is a little too on the nose for me, being an island where he has isolated himself, driving everyone else away despite his desire to escape and live among the people again. I think this is just another way that the interpretation of someone's internal world is just a bit too direct and obvious to ring true, while also having very little in the way of mechanics that set it apart from other levels, making it just another weak entry in a game with one weak level after another. But that's not even what I want to talk about with Bob Brain, however. There is no better example in Psychonauts 2 of how Double Fine just doesn't understand how logs should work than Bob's brain. Every memory vault in Psychonauts 1 served to flesh out the mind you were in, add lore to how they ended up where they were, or even hint at future story events. Psychonauts 2 often just shows things that the mind you are in has already played out and made completely clear. One of the first sequences in Bob's mind chronicles how he lost his mother, who was very interested in plants, and how the grief from that drove him to drinking, in a pretty decent sequence with just enough subtlety to allow the player to make those connections on their own, while still being relatively straightforward. The first vault you find chronicles how he lost his mother, who was very interested in plants, and the grief from that drove him to drinking. You might note some similarities. This isn't how you do audio logs in games, or even visual logs as they are in this case. Just restating something you already showed the player is a no doubt expensive waste of time and money. I wonder if this was more a planning issue where the scenes or log wasn't originally intended to play out exactly as they did, but whether it was a lack of coordination or a lack of creativity, a fair number of the game's vaults play out almost exactly like this. It's quite a shame, since the story being told in Bob's level has a strong level of emotional resonance, but it's dragged down by its subpar implementation of almost all its mechanics. As stated, he withdrew into a bottle after his mother died, but his connection with Helmut pulled him out of it. Their growing relationship grew stronger and stronger until they actually ended up getting married. But, of course, as we know, Helmut sacrificed himself to save the rest of the original Psychonauts from Maligula's wrath. Ford saved Helmut's brain, and we gave that brain a body, but Bob is yet to learn of his love's return. But even still, it is Helmut that pulls him out of his own downward spiral.
If I did, how could I have left him all alone?
Helmut would never say that.
All of this works very well and pays off extremely nicely when we finally see Bob and Helmut reunited, making me wish all the more that Bob's brain had been a little bit more realized. With the way cleared to enter Lucretia's mind, Raz and the reunited Psychonaut founders re-enter her mind to finally push Maligula down to where she belongs, deep in Lucretia's subconscious. Or they would if time and budget weren't wearing down on this game. So, despite all the members entering her mind, only Raz and Ford are actually there for whatever reason. Lucretia's mind is hardly a level, but it does do one thing exceptionally well. First, you have to break through the facade of the circus that Ford placed in Lucretia's mind, before finding that she has made something all her own behind that facade. While you mostly just move in a largely straight line through Nona's woolly world, you might find it odd that you can only find emotional baggage tags here. I haven't talked a lot about emotional baggage, as up till now they've had little relevance to the game outside of granting Raz a free Psychonaut level or two. In the original game, collecting every one in a level would grant you access to the concept art for that mind, but in Psychonauts 2 they only give the aforementioned Psychonaut levels. For the first time in this level, they are used for a narrative purpose, as every piece of emotional baggage is placed against the wall that is holding Maligula back. A wonderful way of showing the harm done to her mind by Ford when he trapped Maligula. But this does more and demonstrates the time she has spent with the Aquatos was legitimately some of the most happy and well spent of her life, as the keys to unlocking those baggage are all found in her memories with them. My only lament with this is that there weren't more such well-thought-out implementation of mechanics as storytelling devices throughout the game, except with the one I mentioned with Helmut earlier. And this is such a wonderful melding of the two. Just before the final conflict with Maligula, Raz is drawn out of Lucretia's mind by Lily's father and the head of the Psychonauts, Truman Zanotto. Lily says he's been acting odd, and he definitely does here as well. He is very obviously sinister at the implication that Maligula might be about to return. So Raz and Lily enter his mind to see what's going on. Even though it takes a little too long for Raz to figure it out, it's obvious at this point that Truman is the mole. After breaking the facade in his mind, this becomes very apparent. The man known as Nick, the mailroom clerk that everyone liked, was actually the deposed prince of Grulovia, Gristel Malek, and it was he that kidnapped Truman using Lobato and put his own brain into the body of Truman. I really love this final level that plays out as a dark ride, chronicling Malek's history as his imagined rise to power. This level does have a strong concept that ties into the personality and history of the person whose mind it takes place in. A nationalist, An egotist who longs to control everything, a ride announcing his own greatness completely under his control, perfectly communicates the mind of Gristle. Despite Raz and Lily making it this far, Raz is the only one allowed on the ride, as he is the only one of the two that is a Grulovian. And there are so many other wonderful details that communicate Gristle's character. This ride shows how he sees Ford as a vile invader who killed the hero of Grulovia, Maligula, and how his family wandered the waste before he finally learned that Maligula still lives. This level also finally reveals why there was such an odd theme of eggs that persisted both through some small elements of Psychonauts 1 and Psychonauts 2. Brought up in the absolute lap of lavish luxury, Gristle grew up on caviar and saw those fish eggs as the symbol of his family's reign. It's a wonderful sign of just how selfish he is when you realize that he literally grew fat on caviar alone. The sheer idea that his excessive gut is made out of tens of thousands, if not millions of dollars of fish eggs is a fantastic way of truly demonstrating his mind-boggling tendency for self-indulgence. This level also has one of the only real puzzles that move beyond platforming. First showing the player a sliding screen of Gristle's trials, then allowing the player to combine each of those scenes in different combinations to explore various aspects of them. While very similar to Glorious level from the original Psychonauts with much less depth, I'll take it. It's something. You can even shrink down into a display of the Whispering Rock summer camp to explore its secrets. There's so much attention paid to this level with so many more mechanics, gimmicks, and ideas. I really wish this was the norm in Psychonauts 2 rather than the exception. Anyways, Lily confronts Gristle in a cutscene and discover where Truman's mind was held, and Lily goes to retrieve it. Maligula awakes and Raz enlists his family to propel him into the massive vortex she created that he might reach the mind of Lucretia and save her from herself. I really like that the Aquatos get this payoff, working together to save someone they all care deeply about. They just everything about them works so well for me. As I stated long ago, Raj shows off against Maligula and is helped by the random kids that now haven't been in the game for a good 3 to 5 hours. Why this decision was made, I really don't know, and the game ends the same way that the first one did.
The only thing I can offer now is everything I've got.
But there's always room for one more!
After this, there's pretty much just Raz becoming a Psychonaut. Again, something I didn't care all that much about since I've already seen this. Raz was already a Psychonaut once. I really don't know why this was the direction this game took, as it makes the closing moment of this game feel much more hollow than it ought to have been. I also don't like the quick cut to credits after this. It feels rushed, but much of Psychonauts 2 feels rushed, so I guess it's appropriate, even if it is disappointing. I find it difficult to sum up Psychonauts 2. It's a game that can't seem to take one step forward without tripping over itself. It's a game about failure and loss, which does often manage to capture the remorse of its characters, while also not wanting to lampoon beloved characters like Ford overmuch, despite his pretty heinous past acts, or provide any real loss, bringing back Helmet so that Bob doesn't actually have to deal with him, or his personal failure. All of this seems at odds with the game's more serious tone, since when we fail, when we lose people we love, we have to learn to move on, to cope, to deal. There are no magic mind editing devices or lost brains sitting around to solve our problems, and this is pretty core to why I find Psychonauts 2 to be not what it could have been. It sits at an odd place between being completely serious or completely zany. It wants to talk about serious issues in a cartoon setting, and it just doesn't land for me. Psychonauts 1, playing a bit more fast and loose with similar concepts and hiding them beneath the veneer of comedy, felt very true and very human. Psychonauts 2 failed to understand the abstract ways that people's mind manifest, or the ways that their internal worlds shift that make it difficult to understand and express ourselves. People aren't neat. People aren't easily comprehensible. And the ways that we can internalize trauma, loss, or guilt can be odd or even funny when viewed from the outside. And maybe it was better to look back and see the silly ways that we can warp our minds to our own personal perspectives. To laugh at the things that harmed us is to take their power away. To so dourly gaze at them as Psychonauts 2 does, helps no one at all. So thank you for listening. I know this one took a little bit longer than the other videos that I've been working on recently. It took a lot of time to really think about what I wanted to say about Psychonauts 2. It is kind of an odd one in my book. It was a game that I didn't really like or hate immensely after finishing. I felt very almost ambivalent about it. I know that I probably came off really negative about it in this review because I mostly talked about the things I don't like, but I chose to focus a lot on that because I think I've heard a lot of people talk about the things that they like about this game, so I wanted to put out some of the counterpoints and things that I found that made it to me kind of an underwhelming experience. So yeah, there are definitely a lot of things good in it, and yeah. But again, I want to thank you for listening this far. And hopefully the next video, which will be on Knights of the Old Republic 2, going to be doing another in the, what I'm going to call the Department of Nostalgia Investigates, a game that I've played a ton, just over and over and over again. So yeah, Knights of the Old Republic 2, can't wait to get that one done. I already have a much better idea of what I'm going to say on that, so I don't think it'll take nearly as long either. So yeah, give it the old like and subscribe if you want to know when that comes out, and yeah, that's it.